Hello, folks. Welcome to my talk. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Southern California, working with Dr. Norbert Schwarz. I have a few findings I'm excited to share with you all today. I'm interested in the questions: what are people's intuitions about humor and what makes things funny? How accurate are these intuitions? And how accurate are we at predicting how funny our jokes will be to others? So our ability to predict whether a joke will be funny or not is tantamount to whether we make a joke that moves the person we're interacting with to feel anything from dying laughing to confused to offended and upset. It's important to understand our own capabilities in predicting how funny our jokes are to others to safeguard against making another person feel wildly different than we intended to and looking like a fool. Our sense of humor shares characteristics of an ambiguous trait in that it's abstract, subject to idiosyncratic definitions, hard to benchmark, and can't be disconfirmed from any single behavioral event. Similarly, the funniness of any single joke can be hard to predict for a given audience for very similar reasons. Dunning and Kruger showed that people's sense of humor were modestly correlated with 7 professional comedians when comparing the humor ratings of a list of 30 jokes. That being said, we wondered how good are people at accurately predicting how funny other peers will find their own self-produced jokes. It should be particularly more difficult in the real world when you're creating something on the spot rather than judging the humor of a carefully selected list of 30 jokes. And so it's a more ecologically relevant question to think about, and we set out to explore this question. We sampled USC students, and we asked participants to create their own humorous responses to comedic prompts. And then those prompts consisted of caption a cartoon, fill in the blank, or create a new meaning for acronyms. And then we asked participants to rate how funny their own responses were. And we had 4 peer research assistants rate the funniness of participants' jokes. Crucially, we found that people's absolute ratings of how funny their jokes are were uncorrelated with peer ratings of how funny those same jokes were. And even in a relative sense, when we look at their rankings of their least funny to their most funny jokes and compare those to peers' rankings of each individual's jokes, we see that these are uncorrelated as well. In short, people are clueless which of their jokes are their best and their worst. We're working on a second replication study to test the robustness of these findings, but this first graph lines up well with similar findings conducted by Sylvia and colleagues last year, and the second graph goes a little bit beyond that. Now, the setting we tested in is such that people are predicting how funny their jokes will be for strangers. We expect people are a bit better than this when predicting how funny their friends will find a joke, and that professional comedians are better than average at predicting what will be funny for a group of strangers. That being said, people make social gaffes all the time around friends, family, and roommates on what jokes will be funny. And even among professional comedians whose job it is to know what is funny and produce it, the most qualified people to speak on what makes things funny often are surprised by what jokes work and which ones don't. This is a clip from the TV show The Comedy Store that brings together a number of comedians to talk about their experiences.
When you were a young guy, Jay, because I drove with you every night and hung with you when you were working out material, I remember you tried 6, 7, 8 bits every night. You spend all day going, is this funny? Is this, yeah. is this, I got it, here's a new bit. Am I right?
Is this one funny?
You know how they say
Professional comedians are constantly testing their jokes in many different styles with different wordings and endings on multiple audiences before they decide what jokes will make it into their bigger shows and recorded specials. Chris Rock, who recently sold his stand-up comedy specials to Netflix for $20 million apiece, and who's been all over the news this week for a joke he mispredicted the outcome for, remarks, I do like 20 to 30 shows in clubs before I even go into a big arena, so I get all of my bombing done on a smaller scale. It's not like I bomb the whole show, but ooh, that first 10 minutes was horrible. Then I dig myself out of the hole. Comedians love to talk about their bombing experiences because they're such an integral part of figuring out what works and what doesn't, due to the difficulty of predicting directionally how a joke will affect an audience. So it's really difficult to predict whether others will find something funny. And it makes sense why it's hard to get in the heads of other people and know what they know, and to know another's political and religious sensitivities and more. And some people just have niche senses of humor. Certainly, people know more about themselves than they do others, which brings us to our next question. How good are people at predicting what will affect their own future experience of humor? So effective forecasting research shows that predicting our future emotions is difficult, and there's little research in this domain applied to humor. We wanted to look at the factor of time of day and how that affects our experience of humor and what our predictions are on this. So we asked college students, when do you think sources of comedy are funnier to you? And if you're like the majority of people have a strong intuitions about how time of day will affect their experience of humor, and they predict sources of comedy will seem funnier in the evening versus the morning. We asked a variation of that question in study 2, but added the makes no difference option, and people still majority predict jokes will seem funnier in the evening. We are curious how much funnier people imagine jokes will be in the evening versus the morning. And so we asked people to simulate jokes in their head and estimate how funny those jokes would be in the morning versus the evening. And they predict the same jokes will be significantly funnier in the evening by a long shot. So we're really curious, and we want to set out to explore this. Does time of day actually affect our experience of humor, particularly in this predicted direction and magnitude? Now, there are several ways how time of day could affect the experience of humor. People tend to report a lower mood in the morning on average, and that's especially true for a younger college-age demographic that we tested. There's also the potential contribution of arousal. People may find jokes funnier when their baseline reference point of arousal is lower, enabling for greater contrast effects. But the first question is, does time of day make a difference at all? Which we'll discuss before we worry about what could potentially drive such a difference. So we sampled USC students and randomly assigned them to participate in the morning or the evening, and we had them rate how funny assorted memes were in 2 separate studies. These memes varied in content. Some were more visual and innocuous, such as this dog meme, which is also my favorite. And they often got at different social phenomena, like the difficulty of choosing what to eat. They differed in aggressive wording and content, such as the squirrel joke. And this levels meme being a wordplay joke that is also about drugs. Our comedy material was diverse in the jokes being made. And what we found was no difference in the ratings of experienced humor for participants randomly assigned to either time of day. In fact, it almost seemed like people might find jokes funnier in the morning, but this difference was not statistically significant. And with our higher powered study number 2, with almost 300 participants, we again saw no statistically significant difference in time of day on experienced humor. With both of these studies, we also collected chronotype data for participants and saw no effect or interactions here with our time of day manipulation. Now, we had 2 small lingering questions about the original effective forecasting questions we had asked. We wanted to make sure, are people assuming the same times when they think of the morning and the evening that we actually tested in? And so we articulated those actual times in the options for the question. And we also wondered, are people holding the jokes they simulate in their heads as consistent between the morning and evening? Or are they thinking that jokes differ in content in the evening and morning, and evening jokes are different than morning jokes, and they're better? So we tested another variation of the original question, and this held the simulated content between morning and evening constant and specified the time of day that we actually tested. And with this, people still overwhelmingly predict jokes will be funnier seem funnier in the evening than the morning. And we see a similar degree of how much funnier they imagine jokes will be in the evening versus the morning. When we asked participants why they made these predictions, they mostly reasoned that they would have a lower mood in the morning versus the evening, and that would restrain their experience of humor. So to conclude, we saw no difference of time of day on humor appreciation, though people mispredicted jokes would seem funnier in the evening. Now, I want to take a step back at this point to mention that the effects we're finding are not like the main themes of effective forecasting research, where people mispredict the intensity and duration of factors on their experience of humor. This is more significant. We found that people are mispredicting the existence of a large effect of time of day on their experience of humor. And they're not just mispredicting that they're not just predicting the scale of how funny their jokes are, they're also mispredicting which of their jokes are even their best and their worst, suggesting a lack of knowledge about the relative funniness of their jokes. So the implication is that people have poor insight into what will be funny for themselves and others, and that people potentially aren't great at monitoring their own experiences, or at least attributing the correct reasons for good and bad humor experiences. Follow-up research questions to think about: does increased experience help with predicting how funny others will find a joke? In other words, are experts better at this, or are people better at predicting how funny their jokes will be for their friends? And further, if not the experience of humor, might time of day affect the behavioral expression of humor in terms of laughter and such? So thank you all for engaging in my presentation, and I hope you have a really great day.